Hello, Shadow Heathens here. We had a little bit of a problem with one of the participants that we had planned on being involved in this, so we're going to have to change format a little bit. What I'm going to be doing is I've invited the regular Cult Night Circle as well as a couple of additional people. If there's anybody on the outside, so to speak, that wants to see about joining us, I'm going to put the link up there in a moment. Not that we have any viewers here. Actually, I'm probably going to wait a little bit to put the link up there. But if you would like to join, send me a Google Plus message or something like that. And I'll be hang on, landing involved in this. So we're going to change form. And there is my mandatory audio issue. But if you'd like to join in, just send me a message via G Plus, and I'll be more than happy to send you an invite. And on that note, I'm going to get the documentary started. Now, what the actual topic here is Theosophy, which was a major movement that dates back to a woman named Madame Blavatsky. This particular woman was born, let's see, let me see if I can get to my notes here right quick, and by notes I mean Wikipedia. Let's see now. She was born in, let's see now, she co-founded the Theosophical Society with Alcott. William Alcott, apparently. Oh, William Quan Judge, it says here, in September 1975. Now, from what I remember, she had a rather interesting early origin, which will be covered in this. This particular documentary has both pro and con content that is rolled into the presentation. And we will be running this, and periodically, upon request, based upon the comments of the people inside here, we will be stopping it for commentary. But since this woman is really the origin of this Theosophy movement, I've decided to grab this YouTube user-made documentary and air it here. The link to the original channel in which it can be appeared can be found in the comments for the video, as well as the links to some of the wiki pages we'll be going to. One thing that I'd like to mention, though, before we get started, back when I was covering the topic of Scientology, one of their precepts is this thing referred to as the bridge to total freedom. And Scientology, mind you, was actually started in 1953. There's also a Theosophy group that was started in 1951, which is simply called the Bridge to Freedom. Now, I speculated while I was covering the topic of Scientology that LRH seemed to be getting a lot of his ideas from Theosophy. And this, to me, seems like another indication that this may be the case. And for some reason, it looks like the icon is just going spinny on the video, so hopefully I'm still actually streaming. Let's make sure that that's the case here. It looks to be good. I've had problems with Google screwing with me in the past, so I just wanted to make sure on that. Okay, now I'm going to start the video up. And incidentally, thanks for joining Para. And I'm going to get a little bit of perspective from Jade a little bit later in the presentation. She doesn't quite date back to the 1800s, but she was there for part of the time period during which a lot of people were buying into this Theosophy nonsense.
She was a spiritual genius and the mother of the New Age. Given her lifelong concern with things mystical, metaphysical, and spiritual.
It's echoing. I was worried about that.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, I'm hearing an echo. At least inside. I don't know what people are hearing outside.
Okay, let me double check my settings here. Damn it. It's always something. The problem is it looks like it was actually... It's using a repeater that no longer exists, which is really confusing to me. Let me stop this one for a second and check something.
It's the gremlins.
Well, yeah, while you're doing that, I'll mention that what they did say is that she's considered the mother of the New Age, or New Age movements, which is an interesting idea, and perhaps is true, because a lot of New Age ideas do go back to spiritualism and Blavatsky.
Yeah, let me try one more thing here. Dum-dum-dum. Okay, good. I just think I might have turned off the wrong thing. Because I cannot hear the Hangout at the moment. I should hear the Hangout. Oh, nobody's talking. Okay, that explains it. Okay, let me check this right quick.
She was a spiritual genius.
Still with the echo?
Yeah.
Ah, I was afraid of that. Let me try one more approach here. There we go. And I'm going to try and open it up a different way to see if that'll work better. Oh, always one tech problem or another. We have 3 viewers at the moment. Oh, of course. I always have viewers when I'm having tech issues. That, yeah.
Oh, it's tradition to have technical glitches. Come on.
Well, I thought I had it all set up a minute ago, but apparently it wasn't echoing a moment ago, but is now. So bring this up here.
This seems to be standard with Google. I've seen people go online and go, but we spent a half hour setting up.
Yeah, I know. Love it to leave it to Google, right? Okay, let me give this one moment here. How's that?
No, it's still echo. And it's not, I noticed with Becky, and last time she said something, it's not just with the video.
Really? It's the internal, too?
Yeah, it's just a slight delay echo. She got loud enough, I guess.
Okay.
I'm hearing a slight delay echo when he speaks, too, so it's something internal. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on my end, then. Let me restart some of this crap, then.
Given her lifelong concern with things mystical, metaphysical, and spiritual.
It's almost listenable.
Almost listenable.
Well, you know when you hear yourself when you're talking echoed back at you and screws you up, it's not quite to the screw up level.
Yeah, hang on. I'm going to have to play with something. Give me a couple seconds here. I think one of the old instances, the audio cable didn't close properly, so give me a moment and I'm going to have to get rid of this crap. So it'll take a couple minutes. Please bear with. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Big trouble with a lot of software and opening and closing channels. Unfortunately. Becky, I agree with you. It goes back to those early days.
Yeah, and it arose at the same time as the Third Great Awakening and is really part of the Third Great Awakening. But for those who are listening, Great Awakenings are times of spiritual revival and upheaval here in the United States. And depending on who you talk to, we've had 2, 3, or 4. The first one being around the time of the American Revolution, or just before, and possibly extending as far back as the Pilgrims. The founding of the nation, the new ideas, you had the Pilgrims, you had, oh dear, I'm trying to remember the name of the preacher, but the earliest American literature is actually sermons. Okay, we're going to try again?
Yeah, give me one more second.
Okay.
Hinduism and Buddhism as important sacred.
That sounds better.
That works.
Good, okay. Yeah, I figured out what it was. When I closed them out earlier today after I did the initial testing, one of them didn't close properly in the control panel. I had to go in and end the task on it. Okay, there we go, fixed. Dun dun dun.
She was a spiritual genius and the mother of the New Age. Given her lifelong concern with things mystical, metaphysical, and spiritual, it's perhaps surprising to discover that she had an effect on the world we know in ways we could hardly imagine. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, HPB, whatever you call her, she was a larger-than-life woman.
I just have to comment, HPV still, every time I hear that, it sounds like some kind of venereal disease.
Well, it is a venereal disease.
It does, yeah.
Blavatsky would make it commonplace to see Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, as important sacred teachings. It's not just yoga that has become part of Western life. It's everything from crystals to religious icons to books on esoteric secrets of the East and West. This woman who was ahead of her time, who had an impact on our world in far-reaching ways, began life as Helena Petrovna von Hahn.
She was born in what is today the Ukraine in 1831. She showed some tendency towards what we would call psychic phenomena and was a rather impetuous child, very independent-minded.
Now keep in mind, as I said it previously, this presentation actually takes pro and con footage and has it all spliced together. And once again, the link is actually in there. Now, her early childhood, as discussed in this, is really bizarre and, frankly, well, I don't like to, you know, go back and look at historical figures and say this person seemed to potentially have had some mental illness, potentially schizophrenia, something like this. I'm going to ask the audience to judge for themselves how this comes across.
I do want to...
was born to a very...
Go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I want to make a point that with the way they described her is quite echoing of my own past before I gave up on the spirituality. Or the supernatural, I should say.
Strong mother. She was a woman who wrote a lot and thought a lot. She's actually considered to be responsible for the women's rights movement in Russia in the 19th century. And she had been married to a military man who was absent a lot of the time and was not so interested in his children. Now, when Helena was born, she was born premature, and no one thought she was going to live, and so it was arranged to have her baptized within 24 hours of her birth because it was thought that she would die.
This has got to be one of her stories, the parts that's coming up. I just have to say that now, because this is a really what the fuck.
During the baptism ceremony, the young aunt of Helena, who was a young girl, was stumbled with a candle she was holding, and it fell on the robes of the priest who was doing the baptismal ceremony and enveloped him in flame. And that, from the very beginning, started rumors about this baby being some kind of a witch or something very strange or having odd powers and so on. Now, she didn't die. Her mother took very good care of her and was very defensive of her and protected her against the prejudices that had developed against her. When she was a young girl, about age 3 or 4, she had a lot of conversation and experience with invisible playmates.
See what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
I know. It looks like you're feeding back to a little bit to yourselves. I can't do anything about that right now, unfortunately.
Can I point out that it's fairly common for children to have invisible playmates? I had one.
Yeah, but in her case, it takes it a lot further.
Yeah, let's relate one of my stories. I had an invisible playmate who was a spirit. It wasn't an imaginary friend.
Yeah,
oh,
the
mine
thing
was a
is,
clown.
part of it is really how it's presented by the parents to the child when they start exploring the notion of, oh, they have an invisible playmate. Now, if the parents take the playmate as being an actual entity of some sort, the entire framework changes. Now, the question is whether this was something along those lines, you know, a tulpa, like we were covering in Power of Wu, or some kind of problem of the mind is unknown. But let us continue for a moment. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, yeah, my parents just thought the fact that I had an imaginary clown that I talked to when I was 3 years old was fun. They just thought it was funny.
That's probably a healthier way to deal with it.
Better. Amusing, I guess you would say. They didn't take it completely seriously. I mean, they didn't, they didn't take it seriously in front of me. You know, I've heard of children who insist that a place be set at the table for their invisible playmate.
Yeah, that's a little much to say the least. Let me actually make sure that I have a straight window of this open. Give me 1 second. There we go. But I need
Difference.
to get one of this in case somebody has to join.
Difference with me is I never really told anybody
Ah,
of mine, right? Because for the longest time I called myself a spirit divinator.
ah,
Hmm.
Yeah,
interesting.
mental, and I do have mental illness, just
Oh,
for,
well,
for
yeah.
clarity. But that doesn't rule me. I don't have hallucinations like that.
And they were very real to her, and no one else could see them, of course. She also, later on, said that there was a Hindu, a man in a turban, who would visit her and appear to her, and that he would save her whenever she was in danger of getting hurt. Later on, she would say that that was Master Moria. At the age of around 11 or 12, her mother died.
Incidentally, the Master Moria character, later in life she would end up claiming to be channeling this same entity, who she claimed at the time was alive somewhere else in the world, if I remember correctly.
And she was taken with her other siblings to another castle to live, again without very much association with her father. And in this castle, which was a place that contained a huge library of her grandfather, who was a master mason and very interested in alchemy and all the other things that were related to esoteric.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Paranor.
Yeah, no, just a comment on what you said at near the start, that his tales seemed to be more just tales, right, and embellishment of things, and things like they've said of South Korean rulers, and his body language is actually showing deception that he knows that they're just stories, even though he's presenting them as a factual statement.
Thank you.
Topics. She read and she kept herself occupied by reading constantly, and she devoured all this information that she could find in the library. And that is where she gained a great deal of knowledge that comes out in some of her earlier writings, although much of the knowledge she gained cannot be explained by simply that contact that she had. When she was 16, she was forced into a marriage because people thought it would be good for her, healthy for her to get married. She didn't want to get into marriage, and it was a disaster, and she very quickly ran away from home and spent the next 10 years on an odyssey of travel around the world, everywhere from Asia to Mexico. She said that she disguised herself as a man and joined the Foreign Legion and fought.
This, of course, cannot be confirmed.
In the Foreign Legion. We do know that she also at one point was part of Garibaldi's troops trying to free Italy, and that she was wounded in those battles, and that she was also dressed as a man for those things.
Also, I was unable to confirm that. This is a lot of this is, especially later in her life, in terms of trying to figure out what is or wasn't true. She kept telling contradictory tales. Now, some of those that are supporters of Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky claim that she was doing this deliberately to try and keep people from getting to. I have no idea why she would do that, actually, but they claim it was a deliberate deception for one reason or another, which I think is fascinating.
But after this point, she began her travels, and those travels became very, very important, because on the travels she was able to first-hand experience shamans and witches and people doing things that were supposedly supernatural, and she made her first connections with a lot of her original teachers who taught her all kinds of interesting things.
Interesting things, of course, yes.
Mm.
She also claimed to draw a lot from that massive library on the occult that her father allegedly had in the home that she grew up in.
Yeah, none of it really gels because it's all he's acting like a witness.
He's
That's the
trying
best way
to, at
put it
least.
right now.
Now, Jade, this particular time period would be in the 1940s. When was the Great Awakening?
1840s.
No, what do you know? Isn't that fascinating? Actually,
Is it,
yeah,
no.
49 to 69 is the world travel time period, according to my timeline here.
Right, and the Great Awakenings was the latter half of the 19th century, the late 1800s through the early 1900s.
Okay.
So her activities spanned basically the Great Awakening. Although, remember, the Great Awakening was here in the United States. This wasn't a worldwide movement.
Oh, it wasn't?
No. However, what's interesting about this time period is that this was a time when a lot of this was the Victorian era, where you're talking about when she went through her travels. And it was very common for both men and women to take the tour, as it was called. Which basically meant traveling the world. And so now, I don't know about her being Russian, if it was a common thing in Russia, but it certainly was in Great Britain.
Well, she apparently grew up in a frickin' castle, so...
Right, but the thing is, I can see where she might have... Let's just speculate here for a moment. Just your speculation. Let's say she was maybe she grew up in a castle, maybe she was a Russian peasant. But she ran away from home and she decided to travel the world at a time when a lot of young women were doing the same thing and hiring traveling companions.
Okay, what's the significance of the traveling companions on this?
Well, women couldn't travel alone, could they?
Well, I get that, but in terms of the traveling companions, would it have been so it would have had to have been a male then? We're not talking just a Sherpa and a yak then.
No, we're talking about another woman would hire another woman to go with her, usually someone to act as something of a servant.
Oh, that's interesting.
So here's what I'm thinking. I mean, this is again sheer speculation. So if you have a young woman who is well-read, and that is, given her history, I would say she was well-read. Whether the library was esoteric or not, I don't know. It could have been that was popular in Germany earlier in the century and the century before, and some of the Russian aristocracy was very heavily influenced by the Germans. So it's entirely possible that she at some time had access to an esoteric library, or perhaps a few esoteric books. But she was clearly educated.
This was also during a time period, incidentally, and this is worthy of note, that there were a lot of people going around claiming to be investigating the paranormal and the whole hunting for ghosts and trying to see ghosts was popular, as well as mediumship. This is really when the whole thing with mediums really was taking a huge turn. By this time period, as opposed to when she was born, when they're more likely to be accused of being a witch. During this time period, it was quite trendy to go and talk to a medium and have them have the strings of the tables lifting and all this other nonsense.
Remember, Russia was at least 50 years behind in many ways, so she could have been thought of as a witch.
Yeah.
But again, my sheer speculation is you have a young, educated woman who is apparently very well spoken. We know that from her future. Even as a young woman, you might have been able to see that. So she finds herself in the employ of some aristocratic woman. Doing things like making sure her clothes are laid out. She's got the tickets for the train, the ship, or whatever. Going down and checking into the hotel. All those little things that the oh dear, there's a word for it and I can't think of it. The companion. There's another word for it too. All of those things that a companion would do. And this would actually give her a chance to travel the world, or the known world. Obviously, they weren't going to South America or deepest Congo. But, travel the known world and to gain an education. And again, sheer speculation. Sheer speculation.
Not
If
just
she
that.
was
Sorry.
if she was accompanying, if she did find her way into the company of a young British woman, she might have traveled in India.
Actually, she did end up heading to India. She actually claimed that this spirit that was talking to her came and spoke to her and told her to travel to India. And that is actually covered later in the presentation.
But
So-
remember, this was the time of the British Raj, the British control of India, and British people went back and forth from India. It was not uncommon, and people went on tours in India. There's like books and movies that talk about this. I'm not going to go into that, but it's entirely possible that she actually did travel the world, although I would think it would be unlikely under her own power.
So this isn't nearly as big a deal as they're trying to make it out to be, then, is essentially the core, then.
Right. I'm suggesting that possibly she did travel the world, possibly as a companion for some other woman, because it was a time that happened. And through that traveling the world, she actually gained this knowledge and information, you know. She could have gone to Africa and met what she would have considered witch doctors, because, again, this was the British Empire and they ruled everything. She could have gone to India and traveled quite extensively there as a companion.
Wasn't this also in Britain the great rush for everything new? Like the dinosaurs were big, the scientific discovery. So, I mean, spirituality just took advantage of a niche.
I might be wrong, but I think this was near the time period that they'd found the bone from, what was it, an iguanodon or something like this.
Iguanodon, yes.
That was part of a hip, I think it was, or something like this, that they declared was the knee of a giant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, this was his time, and this is something, by the way, that I actually have done a lot of research on. The way science, and which really wasn't science, it was more like natural philosophy or naturalism, and naturalism not meaning what it does today. Back then, it meant the investigation of the natural world during the late 1800s. But yes, you're absolutely right. This was a fascination for everything new, every discovery. So yeah, but again, I think it highly unlikely that this young woman from the Ukraine traveled the world on her own, because how would she have done it? On the other hand, given that this was a time when young women who were aristocrats, or wealthy at least, did travel the world, maybe she talked her way into a position as a companion.
Well, it's a great way to network.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I suppose it would be.
Which would help her later in the future.
Yes,
well, let us continue and see what they actually have to say on the matter.
Okay.
She was, beginning in childhood, but more in adolescence, also exposed to Russian occultism in the form of Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, because her
Freemasonry that claimed there was bullshit, but they were showing there was Kabbalah, by the way.
Her great-grandfather had a vast library that in her later recollections she said she had devoured every book in.
It could be that this is where she got much of her knowledge that she was famous for in later life.
As a child, Helena displayed unusual behavior. Her family was often concerned about her future.
Her parents tried to remedy her bizarre behavior and personality by forcing her into an early marriage that was a disaster. She ran away from home and started traveling around the world and began her real spiritual odyssey.
Beginning 20 years, really, of world travel.
She would have been one of the very, very few women who traveled alone.
They claim she traveled alone. Let's continue.
Don't buy
Her
it.
behavior was totally outside the norm, outside boundaries for a woman in that century, unless the person happened to be a queen or someone who was in an inherited position of authority.
I have the feeling I need to pause this so somebody can call bullshit. Do I have to?
Yeah, bullshit. She would not have traveled alone. No woman at that time. Well, okay, let me say there was one or two exceptions, but these were famous British women who did travel alone occasionally. But they traveled from place to place where they were very, very well known. Because there was one woman I remember was sometimes considered the female T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence being Lawrence of Arabia. But no, I call bullshit. She did not travel alone. Again, she likely, yeah, to me, the logical thing was she found her way as a companion. The other thing, too, is given that at this time, spiritualism and mediums and, having seances was very popular, she could have been introduced to that by her traveling companion.
Quite possible as well.
Yeah. Again, sheer speculation, but I'm trying to put what I know of the time into what likely happened.
Okay. Well, I will continue then.
Blavatsky tells us that during this period she disguised herself as a man and joined the French Foreign Legion and served in the French Foreign Legion for some time, doing very dangerous duty.
There's not much said about what she was doing, except that she apparently went to those locations where the esoteric or occult knowledge was prominent.
She traveled to India, in the Far East. She traveled to America, North and South, investigating mystic traditions the world around.
Her next phase was wandering mostly in Eastern Europe in the company of a man named Agárdi Mitrović, who was a Hungarian opera singer and also a political radical who involved her in the struggle against the Catholic domination of Italy.
He got a job with a touring company, or a job in Cairo, probably with the Cairo Opera House. They got on a ship. There were 400 passengers on it, and it had a cargo in part of gunpowder. And the ship blew up off the coast of Greece. Agárdi went down with the ship. Most of the people went down with the ship. Blavatsky survived. She went on to Cairo, and she tried to establish a life for herself there, and how she supported herself was giving seances.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there for a moment. I've tried to look and see if I can find the name of the ship. I have not been able to find it.
I want to say, doesn't that kind of set up a Christ-type story where it may not have been a virgin birth, but miraculously survived, the only survivors?
Yeah, well, miraculous, strange events pertaining to the birth as well as miraculously surviving this.
Well, she may have borrowed from a real-life disaster and just wove herself into it, because that's what these people do. Yeah. It's awfully convenient that her opera singer went down with the ship, too, isn't it? So nobody can track him and find out what happened.
Yeah.
Giving seances in Egypt fits, because Egypt was a place where a lot of the British travelers doing the world tour, or just British travelers, period, went. There was quite a lot of tourism. Hotels that were catered to the British. So, given the time period, yeah, I think that's entirely possible that she was giving seances, probably going from...
It's also most likely that that's where she learned how to pull off the con associated with seances.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, not just there. Take the story of the opera person. It may have been based on a real person in opera, which is also theater. She would have learned the tricks of the trade there.
That's true, actually. The lighting, the ropes, this kind of stuff. That's very true. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's entirely possible. Yeah.
That's a great catch, Para, actually.
Well, I'm a props person, so.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's nice to have some theater in the theater.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, the whole world's a stage, don't you?
Yes.
Oh, yes. And on the thought of stages, let's go to the stage of the seances here.
Yes.
Okay. She connected with the community there that were into paranormal phenomena.
Although very interested in spiritualism, HPB's understanding of the phenomena was somewhat different than her fellow mediums.
Oh, HPB. Ooh, I shouldn't have called her VD earlier. Damn it.
But she did explore this world and produced many manifestations.
She could slow time down. Some other examples where she could make things appear or disappear. Yes, so all of these were demonstrated.
Yeah, to a gullible audience.
Very much.
Might I add that there was a time, I mean, some of these mediums would, like, burn incense, except there was a drug in the incense.
Well, she was in India.
Yeah, so...
Not at this
well,
point.
she was
I
in
think you're still in
Egypt.
Egypt at this point, but
You're still
even
in
so,
Egypt, but
yes.
yes, same difference in a sense. There were a lot of drugs available. I don't remember the drug, but basically it was a soporific and made people very suggestible. So the fumes would come up, and the people would inhale the fumes, and sometimes they were encouraged to inhale the fumes to help them get in the spirit, quote unquote, of the thing. And at which point they're very suggestible, and you could get them to believe anything.
Pretty good gag. That, and I'd be willing to bet that most of the other stuff, you know, time slowing down, yeah, they sat there and they had somebody manipulate the clock.
Well, it's highly
Or-
suggestive
or-
of a soporific.
Yeah, you could
Right,
do
is
that
it-
too
or-
as well, yeah.
A soporific or the power of suggestion. Because remember, these people want to believe. That's why they're going, most of them are going to these seances. Some of them went for a lark, but most of them wanted to believe. So, yeah, they're going to buy it.
Yep, especially with the theatrics that were usually involved with it.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Now let's get back.
In 1873, Madame Blavatsky continued her spiritual journey and set sail for the United States.
She read in the paper stories written by a man named Henry Alcott.
Incidentally, I should note at this point, now that I think of it, that she'd been to India prior to going to Egypt, so she could have learned a few things about the drugs there too. But after getting that knowledge in India, traveling a bit, going to Egypt, she then goes to the U.S. And I'm going to point this out ahead of time. After going to the U.S., she does eventually go back to India and brings the knowledge that she learned in the U.S. back there. And in doing so, ended up actually perverting and fucking up some of the the traditions in India by introducing Western thought into the mix. And this was part of where things started kind of going awry in terms of things like the Kundalini and many other notions being introduced into some of the Indian thought. Just trivia.
Henry Steele Alcott was a respected member of New York society. He had worked for the New York Tribune. With a lingering interest in spiritualism from his youth, Alcott decided to investigate some intriguing spirit manifestations that were occurring at a farmhouse in Vermont.
This guy and his work with the Tribune was based predominantly on reporting on supposed hauntings and these kind of things and all spiritual crap, which was very popular during this time period.
Convinced of the validity of the spirits, he wrote an account of his observations for the New York papers. He then headed back to the farmhouse to investigate the phenomena further.
Their home became a gathering place for spiritualists to witness physical phenomena. So entities would appear and walk around the room and be touched by the persons in attendance.
Now, note there, these spirits were apparently touching people. Now, what would happen is, this time period was when the two of them were together, Alcott as well as, how did I just blank on her name? I've been talking about her this whole fucking time. My brain is not working. Blavatsky. The two of them were together at this time, and he was sitting there writing for this essentially paranormal journal is what he was essentially doing. This is very popular at the time, these supposed paranormal things and this and that, and this notion of ghosts and what have you were huge during this time period. So what he would do is he'd invite people by the house, and once they'd went there, all of a sudden they'd start seeing all these spirits wandering around and this and that, and gee, Could this have been faked? I'd say most likely.
It almost
But
seems
when
like
you... So go ahead.
maybe an early National Enquirer.
Yeah, there certainly is a little bit of that element involved here. But this would have been a lot more mainstream press because this was before we were doing as much with the tabloids. This was leaking more into more quote-unquote respectable journals.
Well, it wasn't.
Because this is what the population wanted.
Yeah.
I'd also like to point out that during the mid to late 1800s, magic lantern shows were very popular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it would be very easy, I think, I'm not sure, have to double check, I think that some of the spiritualists actually used magic lantern because you could project an image, say, on the drapes, and people would think that it was a ghost. Like this image right here you're looking at, that could have been a magic lantern projection or something.
Yeah, but I see the wires.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, that also could happen.
You might not be able to see it on the feed, but there's very clearly what looks to me like a wire going up here.
That makes that interesting.
In any case.
The heyday of spiritualism involved physical manifestations, and the Eddy brothers were famous for providing a plethora of unusual and fascinating appearances.
Madame Blavatsky was intrigued both by a desire to continue her investigation into spiritualist phenomena and perhaps to meet the author of these interesting articles.
So
okay, I was a little bit off. This was before she actually met him.
she was at this Eddy Brothers farm?
According to Alcott, HPB certainly stood out in a crowd. My eye was first attracted by a scarlet Garibaldian shirt she wore, as in vivid contrast with the dull colors around. Her hair was a thick blonde mop, worn shorter than the shoulders, and it stood out from her head, silken soft and crinkled to the roots. I whispered to my companion, "Good gracious, look at that specimen, will you?"
I keep looking at the picture of her whenever they read this off and think, wow, really?
Well, remember, she was older in those pictures.
Yeah, still, even the younger pictures of her, she has that weird eye thing going on there.
Yeah, but that may have looked better in real life. On top, and plus, she was a showman. She
That's
showed
true.
up in dress to impress, and it worked.
Impress, trying to get his attention. Yeah, apparently it did work.
Exactly. It
She's
worked.
a woman. Yep, she's a woman, and she used that aspect quite well.
Exactly. And those eyes, I mean, yeah, they do look weird and intense, but in real life, especially given how good she was at speaking, people may have been drawn into them, you know, those deep-set eyes.
Maybe, I don't know. I don't know. I just can't get past looking at the image and thinking, that description, her, weird.
Yes.
So, actually, just as a quick note here, if I can isolate this for a second and get it out of the way of the other frame. Here we go. Let me move this to the foreground for a second. There we go. This is the two of them together later. Which actually, the photo that was used by Steve Shives in his recent video, cracking jokes about if you look like a wizard. Well played joke at that.
Oh, definitely. The thing that gets me, though, is the similarity in their eyes.
Yeah. Like attracts like? What? Sorry, that too.
Well, definitely.
Here we go.
Alcott recalled that Madame Blavatsky went outside and rolled herself a cigarette. He walked over to her and said, "Permettez-moi, madame," and offered her a light. Later he said that their acquaintance began in smoke, but it stirred up a great and permanent fire. Not only was Alcott's first meeting with Blavatsky memorable, but the manifestations they experienced together at the Eddy farm convinced him of how extraordinary she was. According to HPB, the spirits they encountered during their seances were numerous, and many were familiar to her. Their friendship solidified, and the two returned to New York. Shortly after their arrival, they moved in, not as a couple, but more as kindred spirits.
Something strikes me as fishy, especially with his description of her.
They were a couple. They were a couple. It's just at that time in history, people tried to living together with its, living in sin was a very bad thing. So, yeah, that's kindred spirits. My Aunt Fanny.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying, Jade.
In fact, they liked each other enormously. They got on, and there was a great affection there.
She only became a spiritual teacher after she made the crucial connection with Henry Steele Alcott, who at the time was a prominent spiritualist.
Now, what I wonder is was she feeding off of his fame or the other, or what? Because that's really the way that kind of comes across to me.
I would say the other way around. Actually, he was feeding off her. He was given something.
He was a master. Later in his life, it became very clear he was a master manipulator. Now, whether he was at this point or not, I don't know, but I suspect he was. I'm not saying she wasn't, but he.
Well, the thing is, I think the impression that I got while watching this, as well as some other videos that I watched, is that he basically chose her as the conduit through which he could con a lot of people. Basically, you don't want to be that person. You want somebody else to be instead. You don't want to be claiming I am the next whatever the hell. You want to be promoting somebody else in that position because it makes it seem more legitimate if you discovered them.
Lead from behind.
Yeah, and I agree.
Lead from behind. Yeah.
And who became her entree to the world of New York spiritualism. She begins to write letters to the editor, either defending spiritualists or attacking their critics, making a name for herself in the spiritualist press, where Alcott is already fairly well known.
But being fairly well known, he couldn't do on his own. He'd need to have a patsy.
And a willing one, I would say.
Yeah.
There was a place that they stayed called the Lamasery, in which Blavatsky had a department loaded with some of her collections from India and elsewhere. And she would hold soirees and tell stories. And she very quickly became very well known amongst the elite and the intellectuals.
Incidentally, in response to the comment that I just got, no, sorry, not live chat today, but if you're interested in joining, just send me another note, and I'll be more than happy to invite you.
Blavatsky starts to become a book author in her own right, slowly beginning to work on what became Isis Unveiled.
This was HPB's first major work, and offers her insights on both Eastern and Western religion and philosophy.
Alcott was her collaborator in the writing process, which involved many strange phenomena which convinced him that she was being assisted by invisible helpers, not only in the spirit world, but living men elsewhere who were communicating telepathically or occupying her body and writing through her.
This is the earliest example now, automatic writing was a thing, I think, before this, but this is the first.
Yes, it was.
The first episode of supposed channeling, in terms of claiming that people from elsewhere around the world, etc., were communicating directly through them, that I'm aware of. Because we're talking living people. Now, the whole thing of supposedly channeling the dead was kind of popular on the time period, but the living, not so much, as far as I'm aware of.
When was voodoo discovered, or voodoo?
I'm not entirely sure on that, and unfortunately, I have too many windows open to look it up.
Yeah, voodoo. The reason I ask, because the way I understand it, there's a concept of the spirit using your body and riding you as if you were a horse.
That's not just in voodoo. That's not just in voodoo. In Western witchcraft concept, it's also a concept. Witches were supposed to let demons ride them.
Right. I'm just wondering if the channeling that she's producing here has any tie-in there.
It might have a tie-in to it, but the thing is, she claimed that some of the people she was channeling were living, were alive somewhere else in the world, and that's where I don't know of any other instances of that before this, which is
you
kind of
would call it remote viewing, then, wouldn't you?
well, not when they're taking control of her remotely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a similar concept, but it's more akin to channeling in that they were somehow working through her or holding her hand while she was writing, etc. And that's just kind of odd because these people were supposed to be alive. It's just weird, but it gets stranger, so let's see how strange it gets.
Blavatsky explained that these invisible helpers were adepts, or masters, who were part of a brotherhood of enlightened spiritual beings.
Alcott talks about hands appearing mysteriously and writing. During the night while she's asleep, the composition process of Isis Unveiled is only the first instance where the authorship of items that appear under her name.
Jay, do you hold a seance? It sounds like you're bumping the bottom of the table.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, I was holding a seance. I was trying to connect the spirits, contact the spirits, so that we could have them help us with this, or at least somebody in another part of the world. You know, working on it.
And I'm learning the incense.
Oh, okay, good.
Is somewhat confused because both she and Alcott say that there were many others helping behind the scenes.
She started writing, and she said, well, I get it from my masters. They're dictating to me, or I see it in the astral light, the inner worlds. And I remember when I first read that, I said, oh, yeah, right. And I found myself very soon writing back for a glossary, because the terminology was a huge barrier. I didn't know what all of this Eastern philosophical terminology meant. And yet here,
oh boy,
there was a person who was touching every conceivable subject of importance in areas of religion and philosophy and science, written with knowledge. And I said, how can a person know so much about so many things and handle it with skill in this way?
This guy, if you didn't catch the caption, is from the Theosophical Society in Pennsylvania. No bias there, right?
Well, I found it kind of interesting how he almost added science as a last or a secondary thought rather than the last thought, too.
I'm also wondering how he defines science, because there are a lot of people that are New Agey that claim that this mysticism is a technology.
Yeah, that's kind of why I mentioned the thing about when he said and science.
Yeah.
I just didn't know.
HPV communicated mainly with two masters, Moria and Kuthumi.
These people lived in Tibet, but they weren't Tibetans. They were Indians. And the Brotherhood had picked her to disseminate their ideas as much as they want to reveal to the world through the Madame.
They feel they can do more for the world by not being visible personalities. And there's been a lot of interesting developments of that idea where one hears about ascended masters and so forth.
Oh boy. Just a footnote. Now, when I say that these were people that were supposed to be somewhere else in the world, I don't know whether these guys existed or not. It's really kind of shady, and of course, this guy doesn't go down that route. But she supposedly met these people that wanted to teach her all these things that claimed to be the incarnation of transcendent masters that taught her all this stuff so that she could bring it into the world because they wanted to remain in the shadows.
What I'm interested in is, do those names mean anything? Or are they at all common in India?
I don't know, but they're supposedly... I have no clue. That'd be an interesting question. I'd have to see if I could find somebody of Indian descent on that one.
Yeah, because she could have just made them up, like people make up... well, frequently mediums would make up, like they would have an American Indian spirit guide, and they'd make up, oh, this is Chief Blackfoot or something, you know?
Yeah, but she wouldn't need to make up names. She had the experience of many exotic names with her travels.
Yeah, that's true. She would.
It would help make it sell it, right? Because it sounds
right.
like a name, even though it's in a different language, it still will sound like a name.
But
Yeah,
would people in New York have a clue? I mean, people of British, ancestry might have a clue if a name was an Indian name, East Indian name was correct or not. But people in New York might not. On the
They
other
might
hand,
not, but if she'd been to India, she'd be able to just come up. She'd have a better time coming up with a name that was at least sounding regional and unique enough.
yeah, I mean, for all we know, one of these guys, the name of one of these guys was actually some charcoal seller down the street when she was in India.
Yeah, very, very possibly so.
Yeah.
But that certainly beats up making up some kind of Native American name like Scratching Balls or something.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to keep true to tradition. Coyote Scratching Balls.
Yeah. There we go.
So I'll say, no, we're fully physical. We are what we are by virtue of our training. We have spent our lifetime pursuing spiritual and philosophical and scientific questions, and we feel that we have some answers that we can provide that help humanity to understand what they are, where they came from. The answers to the questions of ultimate concern.
Sure.
How can these people not be skeptical? How? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. I'm not calling her, I'm not trying to apply a label, but the way that this story is sounding is it almost sounds like a schizophrenic hallucinations of personality.
Doesn't it?
Projected from her own illness.
I mean, from pretty much her youth up to this point, it really does sound like that. That's why I made that disclaimer at the beginning, for the audience to be the judge. But that's the way it comes across to me, is this person, was suffering from some kind of schizoaffective disorder.
Yeah, I mean, the whole aspect of channeling live people just screams projection.
It screams what the fuck to me.
Yeah, well, but if they were Tolbas, as it were, of the schizophrenic mind, then all of this makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And this is part of why I wanted to make sure I had all those topics in before I covered Theosophy.
Mm.
Because this is the roots of where the Theosophy movement started. Now, there's roughly, actually, in terms of my list, there's about 8 different cults that were formed well after this surrounding the notion of Theosophy. But beyond that, I know that there's a lot of other groups that aren't on my list that fall into this category as well.
Everybody borrows eventually.
And essentially, Theosophy is this notion that there are these transcendent masters out there that are trying to reveal themselves to us that will be entering into the world, ushering us into a new age of enlightenment or whatever the fuck.
These masters are more spiritually evolved. That means that they can live longer, hundreds of years. They have much more knowledge. They are almost, if you can use an analogy, almost resembling, we might say, the hidden hand theory, which means that behind this world there is a small cadre of individuals who are controlling things.
Which is incredibly New Age.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
no kidding.
Yeah.
Are in separate brotherhoods in India, in Egypt, and elsewhere, who are helping to perhaps control the progress of the planet and spreading the wisdom.
There's actually a group up in Canada, I think that's called, I think it's Golden Dawn, that claims to be a cabal that's doing just that, claims that they're behind the scenes controlling all these aspects of the world.
I have heard that, the stories, but it's, I mentioned in another hangout that it seems like pagan ideas have flipped over and into conspiracy and New Age and tied them all together. This is starting to really sound like that.
Isn't it? Yeah, I mean, this is really the core where a lot, I think, of the New Age movement had some of its roots. And unfortunately, Gretchen, I don't know what happened, but she ended up dropping out of the call. But she's quite the repository of, is that the right term? Well, she has a lot of information pertaining to this. Yeah, repository, that's it, book repository. Yep. Yeah, okay. Cue dramatic cue music.
While living in New York, many guests visited the lamasery and were entertained and intrigued by HPB's stories. They were also touched by something profoundly important in her words.
What?
The two of them had many discussions, and they also had many visitors to their apartment. People who were also interested in the occult, who found everything that Madame had to say very interesting, and at some point, Alcott said to this little group...
Jade, can you do a quick check and see if Houdini ever dealt with Blavatsky or Alcott?
Yeah, I will. I know he dealt with spiritualism and mediums, but yeah.
Yeah, if you could do a quick check on that, because I unfortunately have too many windows already open.
Wouldn't it be useful to form a club or a society to study the occult phenomenon further? And Madame Blavatsky said, yes, that's a very good idea.
The Theosophical Society was formed in 1875 and still exists today with branches all over the world.
That's partially true. There are different branches of the Theosophical Society that still exist. The original Theosophical Society was shut down, and I will be getting to that after we're done with this presentation. But of course, once that power vacuum was there, a whole bunch of people jumped into the proverbial hole.
And the original objective of the society was very simple, one sentence long: to collect and diffuse a knowledge of the laws of the universe.
Or in other words, to spread woo.
Period.
Once a student abandons the old trodden highway of routine and enters upon the solitary path of independent thought, Godward, he is a theosophist, an original thinker, a seeker after the eternal truth, with an inspiration of his own to solve the universal problems.
Now, here's where I, of course, need to sit back and giggle a little bit. Because this ties into everything I've been talking about with the New Agers so far, that it's all about wanting to have sacred knowledge and all about wanting to unlock the X-Men powers and this kind of crap. Now, there are a number of claims that she made about her own supposed abilities, and I seem to have closed the window that's referenced in. But she claimed things like clairvoyance and telepathy and things along these lines. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not going to look it up now. That's boring.
Okay,
Sorry, go ahead.
By the way, although McAfee is giving me a warning, you've got to be careful going here. Apparently there is The Nature and Aim of Theosophy, an essay by Harry Houdini.
Oh, cool.
So I'll try to find that somewhere else.
And if you can get back to me on that, that'd be greatly appreciated.
I will. I'm not going to wander off to some place that McAfee gives me a,
No.
I wonder if I don't remember if they cover when she tried to make contact with the Society of Psychical Research. I just had to say the name. It looks painful. Psychical. Sorry, back to the presentation.
According to HPB, Theosophy, or divine wisdom, refers to the ultimate truth of the Supreme, the cosmos, and humanity.
And better yet, we can make it up as we go along.
It is a truth
Yes.
that has existed from the dawn of time. There has been some question about how the masters communicated with HPB from their home in Tibet. Along with Alcott, many of Blavatsky's followers claim to see these masters as well. Some explain this as examples of astral projection.
There is quite a bit mentioned about out-of-body experiences or astral projection. So it could very well be that this was the true purpose of the society. How do you, in fact, go beyond your ordinary imperfect self and become perfected, to become an adept, for instance? And it seems to me that if you put this together with the notion of masters, it could very well be that the masters were perceived to be human beings who projected themselves out of the body. And that was the reason why they can go literally anywhere in the world to communicate with individuals.
Okay, could I point out one thing?
Okay, hang on a second. There we go.
If you could astral project, why the hell would you stay here on Earth? Go someplace interesting with other life.
Oh, no shit. No shit. Well, unless you're bound here by the electromagnetic field around the Earth somehow.
That's true.
I mean, if you're astral projecting and it's in EMs and it's your EM field that's essentially moving, then yeah, you could have a problem with gravity, maybe.
Yeah, Van Allen radiation, though.
Yeah, that's kind of stuff. Yeah, you know. I don't know. I'm just pulling shit out of my ass right now. I really don't know.
Well, that's astral projection, but anyway.
Yeah, it's bizarre as anything else. Why not? But yeah, the astral projection thing. Of course, they're going there wanting to see some things, and they do. And I'm guessing it's in part 3. I thought it was right during that time period. But they also claimed that letters from these people were materializing as well. Hey, Prudent.
Hey, what's up, guys?
Hey, Prudent. So,
returning to the presentation, we are talking about Theosophy, the numerous cults that are around that, but more so its founder, Madame Blavatsky, the source of much woo.
Oh, I think I'm gonna like this.
And we're on part 3 now.
That is the reason why masters were not looked upon with skepticism, that they did have this ability and that they themselves, Theosophists, expected to have this same ability.
Superpowers.
Perhaps this helps to explain some of the unusual phenomena that HPB was said to perform.
Her being able to physically transform her appearance into that of a man with black hair and then change back into herself. Alcott describes things like this that are just impossible to interpret, but remain fascinating as to what was really going on.
Isis Unveiled was published in
not anybody in
1837,
theater.
and the first edition sold out within 10 days. Not surprisingly, the reviews were mixed.
It sold out in 10 days. That really says something about how credulous people were at the time, didn't it?
Well, took time for things to get around, too.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, especially when somebody's making bizarre claims like this. But anyway, as for the reviews...
The New York Herald called it one of the most remarkable productions of the century, while the Sun called it discarded rubbish. Reviews aside,
I like the latter
HPB
review.
was undoubtedly pleased her message was reaching a wider audience. Eventually, the decision was made to spread the message of Theosophy further.
They remained in New York until 1878, when the decision was made, probably on Alcott's advice, that they, Blavatsky and he, go to India.
And as I was indicating earlier, this is when, after they'd come over, gone to the West for a little bit of a while, after having been to India years earlier, went back to India and started bringing Western tradition there. And this is part of why a lot of the early Indian traditions are really hard to find anymore, because it's been so westernized from this point forward.
Here's a silly question. Do we know if Alcott traveled outside of the U.S. before this?
Well, she allegedly traveled to India, Egypt, and a number of other areas prior to this whole episode, but after all those travels, then she met Alcott, and then the two of them traveled together.
Okay, but do we know if Alcott traveled before meeting her?
I have no idea.
Because he may be the quote-unquote born-again credible figure to sell it, to integrate, because technically their version is brand new, so they've got a whole new area to sell it to.
That's true. That is very true. And sell it they will.
Okay, I'd like to interject one thing. I've tracked down the thing. It is not written by Harry Houdini. It is part of the Houdini collection at the Smithsonian. And it was written by a guy named Buck, and I'm actually looking at a copy of it. It's digitized online, and you can find it. The guy's last name is Buck. But so apparently Houdini must have been acquainted with Theosophy, since it's part of the Houdini collection at the Smithsonian, which suggests that it was one of his possessions.
Yeah.
Oh, we lost the shadow. Only the shadow knows.
No, the Houdini was basically the brandy of his time, was he not?
Yes, he was.
So he must have been feet first into this stuff.
Oh, yes, and which is why it makes sense it's part of the Houdini collection. Houdini undoubtedly collected a lot of information about Theosophy, but he, given that he was a musician and a contortionist and the escape artist, he knew all sorts of tricks. He knew about illusion and what have you. So he would go to these seances because he was interested. It was a big thing at his time. And he'd go to these seances and he could see all the tricks. He knew exactly what happened. He was a very observant man, apparently, because as everyone else was, concentrating, like, now look into the candle in the middle of the table or something like that, or, he was watching the medium's hands. He was watching the movement of the curtains and things like that to see what was happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So
he was watching the person sneak past the door to start banging on the back of the wall to make the books fall off.
Exactly. So yeah, but it makes perfect sense that a books on Theosophy would be part of the Houdini collection.
Yeah.
So
okay, cool. And thanks for stalling, so I could make a quick bio break.
Well, I kind of saw that, so I just thought I'd go a little bit more into it. Yeah.
You're always good for that.
Well, and with the help of Paranor, thank you.
My pleasure. Sure, I'll try my best.
And back to this crap.
Welcome
We've
back,
got about another 8. I think we have another 8 minutes left.
Which he considered to be the land of the sacred wisdom, where more of the sacred wisdom could be found than any other place in the world. And that was the reason why they went. This was the beginning of Alcott's work to try to revive Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia. And for a large degree, Alcott was successful.
Blavatsky also supposedly gave Indians a better understanding and more respect for their own culture.
They were the first Westerners to become Buddhists in a formal, official ceremony. There were certainly Westerners who became admirers of Buddhism before that, but never this kind of formal affiliation.
Shut up.
Once
1 second.
they became established.
Yep.
Yeah. Just a thought, another supposition as to work. If they did go over to India to, quote unquote, sell the new Wu, they would have their first, quote unquote, converts would have come from the Buddhist community, so they would in turn do the whatever that was needed to make them a Buddhist to then give them credibility within the community more so. Yes?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing is a lot of this is about trying to establish credibility, get into a certain community, and then try to try to validate your claims with whatever tricks you're using, and try to get them to sign on to some of your views, which then they will adapt to you if you seem to be getting results that they're not.
Yeah.
And to be quite cynical, it wouldn't be difficult if you are the quote-unquote wealthy Americans to find some quote-unquote Buddhists who would be more than happy to initiate you in their ways, for a certain sum of money.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And we're talking Tibetan Buddhism here from the looks of the photos.
Yeah.
So, this isn't quiet and emptiness, this is loud and rakshas. The two different forms of meditation.
And might I add, being an American, that would fit with Americans very well.
Oh,
I
yes.
suppose it would. I prefer emptiness, not filling. Yeah, anyway.
Eventually, they headed over to Madras, and they bought some property called Huddlestone Gardens, and that became the future headquarters of the Theosophical Society. It was around this time that they met A.P. Sinnett, who was to become a very important figure later on in the society. Sinnett was the editor of the Pioneer, and he publicized the coming of the two Theosophists. And he had, after meeting Blavatsky, some questions about Theosophy, what the teaching was all about, and apparently was contacted by a master through a letter. And out of this came a correspondence that lasted from about 1880 to 1886. The number of letters was about 145 that were exchanged. All of these letters were written either by Kutumi or Moria.
The Kutumi and Moria, the supposed mystics, incidentally, upon investigation by people that analyze handwriting, it's believed that most of these were written by Blavatsky herself. I should state that because the presentation does not.
Sinnett was not the only one who received letters from the masters. There were those who believed wholeheartedly in their authenticity. Others had their doubts.
She did miracles like crazy. The letters from Kutumi giving instructions to her or just giving information were flying like crazy. They landed on people's heads.
Letters landing on people's heads. Sounds like usual trickery, doesn't it?
Actually, it sounds like paper airplanes.
Well, yeah. Actually, I was going to say, seances. Somebody's looking the other direction. Oh, where'd this paper come from? Wow, it's magic. It's beyond. Man, how gullible are we? Oh, wait, no. I've met plenty of people.
Yeah. Welcome to YouTube.
Hey, Van. How's it going? We're talking Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, and I'm going to be getting into the Theosophical Society a little bit more once we're done with this presentation, which is almost over, thankfully.
I mean, I would just go as far to say that, yeah, but it wouldn't surprise me that you would have so many humans just in that day of age to really get caught up in magical thinking, especially before the age of skepticism.
Well, I mean, that's the thing is people really, really wanted to believe, and there's parts of me that wonders if the big skepticism push now is in response to this kind of crap, because for, we had damn near 100 years of people just sitting around letting their brains fall out.
Yeah.
So there has to be a kickback. I mean, we get the whole Age of Aquarius hippie revolution thing, and now people are going, no. Your brains have fallen out. You can't open your mind that much without having gray matter on the floor, dude. Come on.
Yeah, and we're still experiencing that.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can get a little bit further in this.
Next to them on a table. The letters sometimes came through the mail. Whoever she wished to influence or wished to convince that she was who she said she was came through these letters, which I referred to not really facetiously, but as the astral post office.
That was astral, by the way, not asshole, but same thing in this case, I think.
Because the idea of the Brotherhood was very intriguing. And in a way, it still is. I mean, the idea of a group that's looking out for the best interests of the world, that reincarnate when the world needs them, someone who's keeping track of things. It's not just all chaos.
It's nice to feel like somebody's looking over you, even if it is some creepy guy in India. I guess.
Yeah.
In 1885, with a heavy heart, HPB left India for good. Alcott remained to carry on the work they had started together. With a few stops along the way, she eventually settled down in London.
Well, at least he didn't die in a strange boating accident.
My heart is broken physically and mentally.
Okay, we're getting feedback. It's got to be Van. He's the only one not muted. Thank you.
For the first I do not care. Master shall take care it does not burst so long as I am needed. In the second case there is no help. I was ready to shed the last drop of life in me, give up every hope for the last shred of, I shall not say happiness, but rest and comfort in this life of torture, for the cause I serve, and for every true theosophist.
Oh, you were right about the martyrdom. Good call on that, Para. Well in advance.
Thank you.
Part 4, as if 3 wasn't enough.
She again presided over a lodge in London that was a very hot ticket to be invited to attend, and it was not simply theosophists that came to see her, but anybody who was interested in the subjects that she discussed and in meeting a very controversial and intriguing figure.
Then, in the last 2 years of her life, she drew the attention of a well-known British woman named Annie Besant. Annie Besant was a feminist, a union organizer, a writer, a person who was enormously admired in British society.
Incidentally, after the death of Blavatsky, Besant became the leader of the society in 1907.
Getting the approval of a woman like Annie Besant brought her enormous number of new converts, much better press than she had ever had before. Madame Blavatsky left the Theosophical Society to Annie Besant. She turned it over to her, and with that, she achieved the ultimate respectability.
During this period of her life, she wrote The Secret Doctrine, the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. This is Blavatsky's masterwork on theosophy, covering cosmic, planetary, and human evolution, as well as science, religion, and mythology.
All mythology. She made this shit up.
And obviously that means that she wants to be taken seriously as somebody participating in the intellectual debates of her time.
I think if her work had
This
not
would
been
never make it
completed,
to intellectual debates in our time, thankfully.
No, it really... well, in theory it wouldn't, but the problem is there's still a lot of people that, well, buy into theosophy, quite frankly. Actually, when I was dealing with, and I mentioned this earlier, when I was dealing with the subject of Scientology, after doing some research, it seemed that the mysticism of L. Ron Hubbard was taken predominantly from theosophy. For that matter, there's a Theosophical Society that was formed in 1951 that's referred to as the Bridge to Freedom. Now, in just a couple of years later, the first book pertaining to Scientology, Dianetic, was released, and later he ended up promoting the Bridge to Total Freedom as part of that viewpoint. So, yeah, that's interesting. I can't say whether there's a direct connection or not, but it's certainly interesting, isn't it?
she would have continued on for a while longer.
Many people who are mediums or psychics or use their energy in ways that involve things like channeling have health problems. Many of them die young, and many of them grow weak, and other things occur. Now, in the case of Blavatsky and what she was doing, she was actually channeling, and she was bringing through information, and it was a self-sacrificial thing for her. She knew what she was doing, but it caused her to have extreme health problems and glandular problems.
Now, I'm gonna actually say something wooey here, if you guys don't mind for a moment.
Go for it. I have something to say as well.
Okay. One thing that, when they're talking about things like increasing your vibration or opening up the chakras and getting all this extra energy flow going through you, this notion is one that I came across from numerous sources in terms of some of the classical views towards occultism, is that in allowing these greater energies to flow through you, you're more likely to burn yourself out physically because the body is not made to contain this kind of energy, so to speak. Now, I'm not saying I buy into this, but this is actually a fairly classical belief that, you know, if you dabble with too much power, so to speak, that power will physically burn you from the inside out. Go ahead, Para.
Yeah, and also being one who was on the same path as her, not as legendary, of course, but mental illness is a big part of this, at least in the initiating factors that make one believe that you are a psychic, medium, whatever. And the health issues don't come from these beliefs, but just because out of the mental illness, primarily depression.
You tend to take less care of yourself as a result of it, yeah.
Oh, hell yeah. And I'll say I'm paying the price of that depression, you know, but that's outside of all of these claims.
Yeah, but but at the same point, this particular claim is consistent with varied forms of, you know, historic belief as well, and I wanted to point that out. But yeah, I'd go with things like depression, which was clearly shown in that letter, in which he was playing the martyr. So that's very strongly evident.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we can get going with this.
Such that she grew grossly fat. And eventually, towards the end of her life, had to be literally transported around in a wheelbarrow.
Incidentally, the wheelbarrow is why I laughed. I'd already listened to this previously, obviously. So,
and I also want to say I was over 400 pounds.
Yeah, the image of her, this, you know, great psychic woman with all these special abilities being wheeled around in a wheelbarrow, I just thought was the funniest fucking mental image. Couldn't manage to superpower her way to walking, though.
It was influenza. And she was sitting in her easy chair with friends around her. They knew she was dying. And off she went. That simple.
Take that, anti-vaxxers.
Every big newspaper in the United States had at least one, and sometimes two, articles about her death, and they were always on the front page. Because she, by this time, was a world celebrity. Some people didn't know what she was a celebrity for, but they knew she was famous for being famous.
Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, controversial, extraordinary, larger than life, harbinger of the new age.
Wow.
A mystic force.
Virgin Mary love.
It is but the first rustling, but it is a superhuman rustling. It is supernatural only for the superstitious and ignorant. The spirit of truth is passing now over the face of dark waters, and imparting them, is compelling them to reveal their spiritual treasures. And this spirit is a force that cannot be hindered and can never, never be stopped.
They always use the Sphinx.
Hang on. Crap's over. Yay! Okay, there we go. And let me get this screen out of here. I don't need that anymore. And we will go to standard hangout mode here, and I can stop presenting.
Hang on, Shao. Can you do me one thing? Can you full screen or something that picture of her and Buddy there?
And what's his... Yeah, sure. Actually, I can just put that up on the pane for the moment. Let me get that up here. And, whoop, there we go. Let's get her and Gandalf up here on the screen.
Look at his eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
May commented that already. But I want to point out something with this, especially with Jade talking about him being called a master manipulator. Notice how he's leaning in to her, and looks like she's almost trying to get away from him. But the only place she can go is forward.
Yeah.
And being if she's very depressed, which I see in every photo, and not just that Russian stoic look, but there's depression.
Actually,
on her face.
hang on though. Can you see the positioning of the her chair?
Well, yes, but
she couldn't go back if she wanted to.
No, she's got a few inches there.
Okay. Sorry. The depression and
oh yeah, but if she was indeed depressive, then she would naturally want to curl up rather than move away.
Hmm. I don't know. It's a
Now, I
very
could be
odd
reading
photo.
more into it, but
I don't know. I mean, it is a really weird photo. They're both sitting there trying to look incredibly intense. It's just creepy to me, frankly.
I don't think they're trying to look intense. That's natural, I think. It's
Yeah, I
pretty
don't know.
just reminded those eyes.
They might be drawn that way. You're right. But still, it's just a creepy picture to me personally. That's a subjective valuation anyway around it.
Yeah, very much so. I just, yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, anyway. Now I'm going to actually go forward in time a little bit because we're dealing with her here. Now, as I said earlier, back when we had like jack shit for viewers because we were just starting, there's a number of different Theosophical societies around these days. There's 8 that are fairly large, and there are a number that are smaller. Now, going to Wiki here. Let's see now. Annie Besant and let's see now took over the cult in 1907, and thought that the appearance of the world teacher that was predicted by Blavatsky would happen sooner than the time frame which Blavatsky had presented in her writings. Now, Blavatsky had claimed it was going to be in the 20th century. Now, at this point, they started going around and looking for people that they believed were going to be this great teacher. The word they used was, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I'm sorry, it's a Buddhist term, Maitreya, which was supposed to be the last Buddha. This was, let me get myself off screen. I don't need to do that right now. There we go. And I can move myself back down where I belong on the screen. Thank you very much. Let me jump down here. Yay, there we go. I've got a window. Okay. And I'll deal with the rest of it later. To heck with it. I'm not worried about it. In any case, they eventually came across a young boy named Jiddu Krishnamurti and his brother. And they started grooming Krishnamurti, claiming that he was this Maitreya character. And from a young age, this was around about, let's see now, around about 1909, Jiddu Krishnamurti was discovered. However, by 1925, he'd begun to move away from the course which was expected from him by the leaders of the Theosophical Society. And by 1929, he publicly dissolved the Order of the Star, which he was put in charge of, which is a worldwide organization created by the leadership of the Theosophical Society to prepare the world for the coming of the Maitreya, and abandoned his assumed role as the vehicle for the world teacher. He eventually left the society altogether, yet remained on friendly terms with individual members, and spent the rest of his life traveling the world as an independent speaker, becoming widely known as the original thinker on spiritual, philosophical, and psychological subjects. Now, things of distinction, because those that have been following my channel for a while might note, there is a Jiddu Krishnamurti channel, and I do follow it. He became what some would consider the anti-guru, giving talks saying things like, when asked the question, how does one tell if a person is a guru or not, his answer was, if they claim to be a guru or claim to be enlightened, they're not. He spoke against a lot of these notions of transcendent masters and these kind of things. In my presentation on the Kundalini, he is the one that I actually feature in there, saying that that he's talked to these people, and you will never awaken this Kundalini spirit. It doesn't exist. It is not really there, etc. Generally, when you see something black and white with a person that's Indian, they're male, but it's really kind of almost hard from the image to necessarily tell that it's actually a male. That's Jiddu Krishnamurti. I consider this person somebody that's truly spiritual in some regards, in that they say to people, yeah, we have science. Pay attention to what science tells you. These kind of things. They walked away from this spiritual role. They walked away from a cult which was laid out for them in advance. Here, have this cult. Instead, after he had the power, after he had the authority and the autonomy to do so, not only did he disband this group, but he took all the assets that had been given to them and tried to give them back to people, including the castle that had been part of this group for a while. He gave back the land, he gave back everything, and went out to live a relatively humble life, going around talking against some of the spiritual nonsense, or telling people things like the only way to try and find yourself is inside yourself, not inside some book, not in the words of some other. That also, I used that particular clip from him as well. I do think there are some people out there that get into this kind of spiritual notion, that move beyond the woo and move beyond the horse shit, and just come to this understanding that if you want to try and find some kind of enlightenment, you got to walk your own path. You're probably never going to get to the end game, so to speak. But really, if you want to become a whole person, if you want to seek enlightenment or what have you, don't go to these kind of wingnuts. And somebody that was part of that was being groomed for cult leadership on a massive scale, that walked away, I think is worthy of respect. On that note, to the room. We have any further commentary?
Well, I did want to mention that something I mentioned off the air is that Krishnamurti was not the first one who was supposed to be the Maitreya. Is that the right term?
Yeah, close enough.
Yeah, there was
I don't know the
a
pronunciation.
young. Yeah, there was a young man who was the son of some followers of Theosophy, who was supposed to be the first one, and then I think was it Blavatsky perhaps, but or Alcott, I don't remember which of them, saw this young man in the marketplace, and decided he was the one. Somehow was struck with the idea that this was the one.
Let me close down these. I'm going to double check on what I have on. Anyway, further commentary from Para.
He had to step away.
Oh, okay, sorry. Well, let's jump to Van.
I came in so late.
I'm sorry, man. I tried to get you in the invite earlier.
I got it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come on yet.
That happens.
I came in a little late too, but I think you pretty much covered all that needed to be said. I don't really have any comment really to make.
And as I'm talking to y'all, I'm actually surfing the wiki on it. on
Interesting stuff, isn't it?
Holy moly!
Oh yeah, they were like the wellspring of horseshit.
Right, and they were incredibly popular. But the one thing I would like to add, and this is something I researched many years ago, one of the things about the Theosophical Society that was positive was that Theosophy promoted a universal brotherhood of humanity, where people were equal regardless of race, creed, color, sex, caste, what have you. And that was a pretty radical concept for that day. And so, you know, when Blavatsky would go and speak, and from my recollection, she is the one who did most of the speaking. Alcott was kind of behind the scenes. I could be wrong, but that's the way I remember it. She would talk about this universal brotherhood of humanity. And this had, for all the craziness of Theosophy, this concept had a lot of influence on others.
Well, you really need, for a cult, you need a level of the carrot in the stick. Now, the carrot wasn't just this supposed sacred knowledge, but also this idea of oneness and universal acceptance and this kind of stuff, and claimed that we were entering into a new age.
Yeah, and that there were parts of all different religions that should be considered and respected and looked at and things like that. So it was their own concept of sort of a universalism of religion, of people. But as I said, it had apologies for not remembering all the details and who was influenced, because that was a long time ago. But it did have a very positive effect. If you can imagine her speaking to a group of people in New York in the late 1800s, especially people of the aristocracy, and remember, this is the time of the robber barons. So, you know, they didn't care about the little people. They literally would run trains without safety, and who cared if people died because there were more people. So you've got Blavatsky going into these circles and talking about how the little guy is just as important as the big guy, and the black people who are the Pullman porters are just as important as the people who own the railroads. That was pretty radical for the time, and it caused a lot of people to think.
You know, one thing that catches me about it is that with her establishing a Christ-like, image, had the martyrdom, this almost sounds like a version of heaven, and all of it is within the earthly realm. So supernatural stays, but God deities are gone.
Incidentally, just one final note on Krishnamurti. A few days before his death, in a final statement, he declared that nobody among either his associates or the general public had understood what had happened to him. He added that the immense energy operating in his lifetime would be gone with his death, making sure that he could have no successor. Wah, wah.
Oh no, he did that. He did that because he didn't want someone to take up the mantle of successor.
Exactly.
He wanted to stop the bullshit. And that was pretty clever.
Yeah. No, he did end up dying of pancreatic cancer in February 1986, by the way, at the age of 90. His remains were cremated. Yay. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about he's a pretty good teacher. Now, granted, a lot of the footage that I have is from later dates. But what gets me is people sit there and they'll follow people like Spirit Science, Teal Swan, many of the others that I featured in my videos that clearly just want a following. And it's refreshing to me with all the cult leaders, and whether they be people mainstream religions like your Pat Robertsons and what have you, and all these people that are clearly out there just trying to make a buck and do it by spreading a message and trying to make it so that it's more palatable or more easily accepted by people. There are very few people out there that have the integrity to stand up and say this is crap, especially when they have the power to do otherwise. Now, being somebody that in my youth ran a cult, I really identify with Krishnamurti because, I mean, there have been times I've joked about starting another one at some point, and, well, I think I probably could. No. It's not the way. What we should be doing is trying to tear down cults, tear down false beliefs.
Yeah.
Now,
that's really important.
I'm not sure about this because I've read about Krishnamurti in the past, but I think, I don't know if you found this in your reading, that the reason he wanted to be cremated is he didn't want to have a grave that people would then come to.
Yep.
That's what I thought.
That would be the case, yeah. He was doing his best to make sure he was not revered. For that matter, his teachings, he made a point of referring to them as the teachings, not his teachings. So to even further that. I mean, I've never come across an individual that went to so much trouble to make sure that they were not deified in any way, shape, or form.
Right. It's like he was handed the keys to the kingdom,
and he said, "Here, take them back."
Well, he realized that the kingdom was made of.
It's made of paper.
Straw.
Made of paper, yeah, made of straw. That's the word I was looking at. Made of straw, and so he gave the keys back and set fire to the straw. Yeah,
that he did, very definitely. And on that note, I think we should probably take this episode to a close. For those that are viewing, those that enjoyed, give a thumbs up, like, share, etc. God, I'm supposed to actually promote my Patreon. I hate doing that. It's a channel thing. If you want to do that, if you want to support the channel, it's always appreciated. But Cult Night is not a very frequent thing I do because it generally takes a lot more time and effort to get organized. But for those of you that join, thank you. And if you have a cult you want me to cover, let me know. And on that note, have yourselves a great night.